name is Bill Peacock. I'm the Vice President for Research and the Director for the Center for Economic Freedom at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And we're glad to have you here at our panel today on resource adequacy in the ERCOT region, which of course doesn't include all of Texas, but includes a significant portion of our state and the market. We have a great panel today, and we're looking forward to the discussion on this issue. Now, back in 1995, Texas began its transition to competition in the electricity market in Texas. And really what has entailed since, what we've witnessed since, has been nothing short of remarkable. I think one of the most remarkable advances in limited government since the founding of our country. I think it's up there equal, if not above, the transitions that we've seen in telecommunications and airlines and trucking, for instance, those types of things that have received a lot of national attention themselves. Partly, I think, because we're talking about all these fixed lines, and everybody's seen this as a natural monopoly. Well, it turned out it's not a natural monopoly, at least in a lot of ways. And yet, even with all this success, we haven't heard much on the national level about the success of what we've seen here in the transition to competition in Texas. Of course, sometimes here in Texas, even, we don't really seem to acknowledge the success that we've had, and we have some of that going on right now. Where we have critics who've said in the past that this isn't really working like it was planned. For instance, back in 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, when prices were too high, one group of critics were saying that competition isn't working like it was supposed to. Now that prices are too low, we have similar complaints. But I think one thing you just can't really step away from is that Texas has the most successful competitive electricity market in the United States, if not the world. Yet we're currently facing these calls to eliminate what I think is kind of the linchpin of our electricity market, the energy-only market, and move to a capacity market. The discussion about capacity, energy-only, those type of things could be highly technical in a lot of ways, very complex. But I think at the simplest level, really the questions that we're asking is who do we want to determine how much electricity we have and what we want to pay for it? Do we want the producers and consumers, the market participants, to make this decision, or do we want regulators and policymakers to make that decision? That's the question before us today, and I think we have an excellent panel here to discuss that issue. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Our first speaker today is Sam Newell. Sam is the principal of the Battle Group, and is an expert in electricity wholesale markets, the transmission system, and RTO rules. He supports clients throughout the United States in regulatory, litigation, and business strategy matters involving wholesale market design, contract disputes, generation asset values, and other things. He has provided written testimony and other oral testimony before state regulatory commissions and FERC. Please join me in welcoming Sam Newell.
Good morning. It's nice to be here in Austin. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Bill, for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here with this distinguished panel and with all of you. I'm going to address 5 key points, some of the takeaways from the work that we at the Battle Group did this year for ERCOT and the Public Utility Commission. So the 5 points are, why are reserve margins declining? How low might the reserve margins fall? Is there a minimum acceptable reserve margin from a policymaker perspective? And then I'll talk about how the best market design depends on the reliability objectives. It depends on what is the minimum acceptable reserve margin, if any. And I'll talk about timing considerations. This is a very familiar chart to anybody who's been following this issue. The blue shows over time how the reserve margin is projected to decline. This is from a report that ERCOT publishes. And what you'll see is that it's projected to fall below the target. Now, by the way, first of all, the reserve margin is the amount by which total supply exceeds the peak projected demand. And the target is kind of an old-fashioned target based on an engineering principle of how much capacity would you need to have no more than one event in 10 years where you don't have enough supply to meet demand, even when it gets very hot and some generators are unavailable. Now, reserves are declining because investment is not keeping up with high load growth. Now, these projections, exactly what the reserve margin will be and when, that'll change. And I think Commissioner Anderson will talk to you about that a little bit later. But even as that changes, the fundamentals point to declining reserve margins. And I'll explain why. And lower reserve margins will mean slightly lower reliability for customers. And I'll talk about that too. So, why is there not more investment in generation right now? And there has been in the past. What is happening now? What are the fundamentals? Low gas prices and low market heat rates with now a very efficient fleet and a lot of wind generation mean that generators, the price is low and generators earn very little most of the time, except when it's very hot and prices and the market becomes tight and prices sometimes spike. Now, the Commission has recently done a number of reforms that I view as very positive to allow the price to reflect the scarcity conditions when you start running out. But even so, scarcity-driven price spikes are very rare. How low will the reserve margin eventually fall? Based on our analysis, we expect the reserve margin to fall eventually to about 8%. That's compared to the target of about 14%. And why is that? Well, we simulated the market under all different weather conditions. And by the way, other parties have looked at our analysis and found the same things. And what we found is that at much higher reserve margin than the 8%, prices usually aren't going to be high enough to support investment. And at much lower reserve margins, the market would be so tight, that prices are going to be high more often. In fact, prices would be high so often that there would be a lot more entry. And you'd expect the reserve margin to settle out plus or minus, but around the ballpark of 8%. And by the way, that may be the economically optimal level of investment in generation if the energy prices are right. And I think the Commission has done a lot to move energy price sort of rules that affect the prices in that direction. But there still may be load shedding, rolling blackouts, which in itself can be economically inefficient because you're indiscriminately cutting high-value and low-value customers. You just cut them all. So until the market evolves to a place where customers are really responding to the prices and the lower-value customers are getting off the system when the prices or reducing their load when prices get really high, until we get there, low reserve margins can mean rolling blackouts. Now, still not very often, and I'll get to that. So remember, we said the reserve margin under current market fundamentals will drift down towards about 8%, or 6 to 10, depends on a number of assumptions. But that raises the question: is 8% high enough? Does it provide enough reliability? Is there some minimum, especially until the demand side develops in the way I described? Is there some minimum level where regulators won't panic or otherwise intervene in the market? Well, before deciding if that's high enough, let's put reserve margins in a broader context of reliability. And as Commissioner Anderson will, I think, also explain later, reserve margins help with only some kinds of reliability and not with others. So this graph it shows 3 different types of reliability events from a customer perspective. And it shows how they translate into loss of service in terms of minutes per customer per year. Let's look first at the piece way at the top. By the way, see, I had to break the axis here because the kind shown at the top, transmission and distribution outages. And this is mostly distribution outages. On average, and this is ERCOT, this is Texas data, about 100 to 300 minutes per customer per year loss of service. And that's without major storms. So with Hurricane Ike, it was much, much higher. So that, that's under more typical conditions. Now let's look at the bottom little line there, dotted line. This is outages from supply disruptions, like we've seen in the past 10 years. April 2006, there was a heat wave, unseasonably early in the spring. There were a lot of generators on maintenance. February of 2011, there was a freeze-off that, disabled a lot of generation. That really wouldn't necessarily be helped by a higher installed reserve margin. Those kinds of events, if you average them out over 10 years, that translated to about, on average, 2 minutes per customer per year of loss of service. And now let's look at the third kind, which has kind of been the focus of the discussion, which is reserve margins. What kind of loss of service can that translate into? That depends on the reserve margin. So at a very low reserve margin, you're going to be more likely to have rolling blackouts more often. At a very high reserve margin, not very often at all. And so what I'd like to point out is that, so just look at, for example, at 11%. At 11%, which is well below the current target, at 11%, you'd expect loss of service from, not enough supply, less often than the other kinds of reliability. Still much, much less often than from transmission and distribution outages. And at the target level of reliability, or closer to 14%, it's basically near zero. So you've pretty much eliminated this type of reliability threat, but not the others. Now I don't mean to suggest that these kinds of reliability events are necessarily comparable in every way. There are a number of differences how people perceive them, but just I think this kind of comparison is instructive nevertheless. And so the question I think this leads to is, can we accept something like 8 or 10% reserve margin that the 6, 8, 10% that the current market design might lead to? And its rare rolling blackouts until more demand response develops? Can we commit not to panic and have some sort of big regulatory intervention when those kinds of events happen? That question has a lot of bearing on what's the appropriate market design or market rules. So if you can accept 6, 8% reserve margin, then the energy-only market is the best. The current design is the best, and it's the simplest, and it's the most efficient. In the long term, it leads to what Bill described as letting the market decide what's the appropriate level of investment as opposed to regulators. Provides efficient operating price signals. If you can accept those reliability implications, that is the best design, period. And it is the envy of a lot of other parts of the world, I agree. Now, but if that's not acceptable, and it may not be, that is very below the current target. I have not heard the political leaders say they are willing to accept that. I don't think we've heard a clear articulation of what the objectives are. But suppose you need to have 17%. I'm just going to be extreme. That's way above the point of diminishing returns. If that's the case, having a resource, it's not going to happen on its own. Having a mandate placed on load-serving entities to buy that much reserve and having a capacity market to help meet that need, where all types of resources would compete to meet that need. That is the only way to get, or short of full re-regulation, if you must have, say, 17%. But that kind of approach is much more complicated. It's full of administrative determinations and rules that are controversial, can lead to litigation, lots at stake. There are transitional challenges. I mean, I think we've all seen a lot of resistance to this idea as it's been discussed this year. But I will say, by the way, that some of the claims about how much more this will cost than the alternatives are way overblown. They are way overblown, just like some of the reliability threats have been exaggerated. And also some of the claims that these markets don't work in other regions, I think are also unfounded. We've looked at that probably more than anybody and found that they meet their objectives quite effectively. You may not agree with the objectives. And now, finally, if you can accept some more intermediate level of reserve margin, say, 10 or 11 or 12%, we're more in a gray area here. There are a lot of approaches that could work, a pure energy-only market probably won't get you there, but you don't have to go all the way to adding a reserve margin mandate and a capacity market. You can get in the ballpark with more modest interventions. For example, supporting demand response development and ways to boost the price artificially. So just to wrap up, there's been a lot of disagreement about the urgency of this issue. But I'll say we're not about to experience rolling blackouts all the time as a way to manage the grid. That's not about to happen. But decisions on reliability objectives, I think, should be made more explicitly. And decisions on that and any major changes to the market design really have to be made well in advance with a lot of foresight. Well before a point where you think there's a big risk of falling below some minimum acceptable reserve margin. Any major initiative takes 1 to 2 or more years to implement. New generation takes 2 or 3 or more years to build. So again, you need to plan ahead if you're going to try to change the course of the market. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Sam. Appreciate it. Our next speaker this morning is the Honorable Ken Anderson. Commissioner Anderson was appointed by Governor Rick Perry to the Public Utility Commission and was reappointed in 2011 for a 6-year term. He has more than 20 years of experience in private practice in the areas of corporate finance law and regulatory and administrative legal matters, and he had previously served as the Director of Governmental Appointments in the Office of Appointments for Governor Rick Perry. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Anderson.
Good morning. Let me first, for those of you who, like I did before I got involved in this, really the only thing you paid attention to in the electric market was when you flipped your switch and the light either came on or didn't come on. And I have to confess that even in our household, we didn't actually switch providers until I'd been on the commission over a year. After we did it, and I almost wish we hadn't, because after we did and our rate went from 14 cents down to 10 cents, my wife, who pays the electric bill in Dallas, was very vocal about why we hadn't done it a few years or more earlier. So I will say that the market really has been a resounding success. We're one of the few states that has very, very robust choice at the customer level, retail competition. Before I get into the details, what I'm going to talk about today is the whole notion of what we're facing in resource adequacy, issues that surround what I call the capacity reserve margin, and why I don't think that we need to panic. We need to be deliberate, but we also need to remember a few really important facts. The most important being that energy-only market that is experiencing growth, that is experiencing an increase in electricity consumption, you expect a shortfall below whatever target you set 4 to 5 years out. Why is that? Because in an energy-only market, your generation only gets paid when they run. The investment, and this is unlike the old regulated model, the investment in plants is made by the owners. They bear the risk. Under the old model, the old regulated model, if a utility wanted to build a new plant, they'd have to come into the commission, in a case, make the, prove up why it was necessary. It'd be a long, expensive, convoluted process, often taking a year or more. The commission itself would engage in integrated resource planning. And at the end of the day, if the utility got the permit to build the plant, we all paid for it. They were guaranteed, a profit. They were guaranteed to earn a return on investment, on the undepreciated portion of the investment over 30, 40 years. The result was you had, as you always get in regulation, a lot of inefficiencies. You had plant capacity factors below 50%. Now in competitive wholesale markets, that capacity factor has risen to well over 90% in many cases. I mean, you had nuclear plants running at less than 50% capacity in some parts of the country. That's how inefficient the market was. You had older plants that operated for decades. One of the strong benefits that we've had in ERCOT with our market is that our fleet in the last 15 years or so has been almost totally rebuilt. We're probably the most efficient fleet in the country. We're one of the cleanest in the country. And that has resulted in a bit in what Sam is showing on his graph. But there's some important questions I want to get into on that. The Commission has been looking at this issue since really 2010 in a major way. It's important, again, to note that we shouldn't panic. Numerous resource adequacy initiatives have been undertaken. We've looked at our rules and, more importantly, the rules at ERCOT, the protocols that are called, in order to make sure that when ERCOT operates the grid, that their actions do not result in uneconomic outcomes. That was happening in the past. We've also begun the process, or actually we've adopted a process that will increase the system-wide offer cap. We've done a lot of other very technical, you can call them modifications, improvements, adjustments to the market design in order to ensure that we get the correct price signals. And I don't want to get too technical about it, but the whole point of these changes is to get the right price signals. Nevertheless, we will always have to keep our eye on it, but the important thing is not to panic. Now, let's get into the whole notion of what is a capacity reserve margin and what's the impact. Currently, ERCOT has a capacity reserve margin of 13.75%. It's a target. It's not a requirement. What does that mean? That means that It's just a signal out there to the generation community of of what the system conditions are likely to be. It doesn't result in anything. It's important to also note in this discussion the distinction between a capacity reserve margin and an operational reserves. ERCOT on a daily basis buys 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts in operating reserves. What are operating reserves? They are used to balance the grid. Electricity consumption goes up, goes down, you've got to have reserves. There's also reserves in the event that you have a unit failure, which happens. That's really where you get your daily reliability from, is the operating reserves. They, again, generally on any given day, and it depends on the season and the weather forecast, they buy operating reserves that range from approximately 5% to almost 7% of expected load. Now, contrast a target with a mandatory minimum. If ERCOT or the PUC or the legislature were to adopt a mandatory minimum reserve margin, then that target becomes very, very important, because it will drive the amount of generation that you need to procure, either in a forward capacity auction or in some other process. And it will translate into billions of dollars every year that's imposed on consumers, whether on any given day you need it or not. The other real problem, and this to me is the biggest problem, in an energy-only market, we can all decide how we want to hedge our price risk. When I buy a fixed rate contract at our Dallas home, that's a hedge. When you buy a fixed rate contract out there, you have choices right now depending on your financial situation, or in my case, I buy fixed rate, even though I'd probably do better in a variable rate, because again, my wife pays the electric bill, and I just rather, it buys peace. She knows what the rate is, and she understands when we use more electricity, the bill goes up. When we use less, but it's not a price of the actual kilowatt. But residential consumers, all the way to large industrials, they can negotiate their price, they can look at the price, and they can hedge their risk. With respect to the various ancillary services, the operating reserve, again, at ERCOT, you make a decision on how you want to pay for that. If you're a load-serving entity, if you're a retail electric provider that sells electricity, or your municipal-owned utility, or a co-op, you get to decide. You've got choices how you want to manage that price. You can provide it yourself. You can buy it yourself in bilateral contracts. And by the way, most power in ERCOT is bought and sold in bilateral contracts. It gets reflected in the market, in the daily market, but it's actually bought and sold in bilateral contracts. Or the third choice, you can let ERCOT buy it for you. With capacity market, you cannot, there's no way to hedge it. It just is. Loads are charged for whatever the capacity payment is. Now it's important then to talk about, well, so what does a capacity market, or rather a capacity reserve margin actually do? Well, let me tell you what it didn't do. Back in April, since ERCOT has become the balancing authority in the late 1990s, we've never had a grid collapse. In fact, we've never had a grid collapse in ERCOT. Unlike the East, unlike the West Coast, we have had some load shedding events. In April 2006, because of a combination of wind suddenly dropping off, a lot of plants down for maintenance, and extraordinarily hot weather, over 100 degrees, unexpectedly, we had rolling blackouts. At that time, we had a capacity reserve margin of over 16%. The same thing in February. of 2011. At that time, depending how you count it, we had a capacity reserve margin of between 16 and 17.5%. Capacity reserve margins do not guarantee you that you won't have rolling brownouts or rolling blackouts, because that's based, those events were events that are outside the planning criteria. And whether you have a 14% reserve margin or a 20% reserve margin, you're not protected against those extraordinary events. Back in the winter of '89, if you were around in that time, there were rolling, and this is before ERCOT was the balancing authority, each of the utilities was their own. They had rolling brownouts down in Houston when they had a capacity reserve margin of over 30%. So it's just important to understand the impact. We've seen before where ERCOT has projected there'd be shortages. It's not uncommon. Again, in an energy-only market with growth, you'll expect it. So what's the scope of our problem? And I'm going to run over a little bit because this is really critical. A capacity reserve margin only really deals with your summer peak. So what's the scope of that problem? You're going to hear some folks say, well, we need more baseload generation in ERCOT. We don't need more baseload. If you look at it, our low peak is flat. Where we have growth is our summer peak. So what's the scope of the problem? Going back to 2011, which was really an outlier year in weather, but let's use that as the problem. In an hour, or our resource adequacy problem, to the extent we have one, is probably, at worst, an issue of 160 hours during your summer, and that's out of a total of nearly 9,000 hours in a year. That's less than 2% of the time. That is exactly the kind of issue that demand response and price response can deal with. And oh, by the way, as I was talking to Sam last night, it may well be that the market design we have is already dealing with that problem. We just don't know it, we can't measure it, and we're going to fix that in order to allow ERCOT to measure it. But it turns out that in August of 2011, during that extraordinary heat wave, ERCOT on a daily basis was under forecasting load on some of those peak days by as much as 1,600 megawatts. What was accounting for that? Well, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. Industrials were managing their transmission costs because it's based on a complicated formula that I won't bore you with. But I also think now, as I've talked to some parties, that actually there were retailers who were using the market and their customers to reduce load, their consumption, because they had so much power. They were reducing their customers' consumption, selling that power back into the market. In other words, the profit motive in the market was actually resulting in the behavior you would expect to see. In other words, if you had bought power for, let's say, $90 a megawatt hour across peak in advance, and the prices had gone up to $3,000, and you were able to get your customers to drop even 1 or 2 or 3 megawatts, that power is automatically sold back in the real-time market, and you're paid for it. So you are seeing the market itself adjust consumers. That's going to only expand as we move forward with all the technology. The impact of the reforms, and then I'll stop, and you can see the rest of the slides on my webpage. We've had over 4,000 megawatts of new generation announced since we began our reforms in late 2010. And out of that, over 1,300 megawatts is not even reflected in ERCOT's CDR. To go to the last page, this is my analysis of the reserve margin. And what's important about this is that it shows that we do not dip below, and the difference between mine and ERCOT's is I add into there various generation that's been announced, but that doesn't technically fall within the parameters for being included in ERCOT's report. It also includes now the fact that wind is likely likely to get a higher load carrying rating because I think ERCOT, and again, it's not in the CDR now, but they're probably going to break out coastal wind, which has a much higher capacity factor, and in fact, West Texas wind right now only gets rated 8.7%. Over a year, really 2 years ago, ERCOT, the staff at ERCOT actually said it needed to have an 11% factor. The board at the time decided they wanted to take more time to see if that actually is following through. So I've added that back in. And then most importantly, we have a number of units in mothball. I've added back in the mothballed units that can be brought back in under 6 months. We now have a mechanism at ERCOT to bring that stuff back if necessary. That results in for example, rather than 13.2% this year, we have over 16% reserve margin. We have over 14% in 14. In 15, we have over 14%. We don't drop below that until 16, but even then it's 12.7. Now, until December of 2010, the target reserve margin was 12.5%. Why was it raised to 13%? Well, it was a very, 13 1/4 or 3/4. It was a very scientific process. That was the compromise at ERCOT in the stakeholder process between 10% and 15%. Very scientifically done. It also, by the way, there are a couple of major power plants that are coming online in 16, but right now don't have an in-service date before the summer of 16. I've been told by those owners they will have those plants in the summer of 16 because they need to have them in both because of their financing terms and so there's a high likelihood that at least part of those units are going to be online. Then it jumps back up to over 13% before beginning to fall again in 12.5. Bottom line is that while I don't want to leave the impression that there's no concern, we have to keep looking at it. We are making changes. We've got projects open at the commission right now dealing with demand response, or what I prefer to call really price responsive demand, to make sure we eliminate the impediments. What incentives, if any, although I always get nervous when you talk about incentives. The main thing I want to do is eliminate any barriers or disincentives to loads, which are consumers, actually participating in the market. And with that, I look forward to answering your questions. And apologize for that.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Our next speaker this morning is Dr. Robert Michaels. Dr. Michaels is a professor of economics at California State University, Fullerton, and a senior fellow here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. His areas of qualifications are industrial organization, antitrust analysis, regulation and deregulation, and competition in the electricity and gas markets. Dr. Michaels has conducted significant research on electricity markets, particularly here in Texas, including areas such as market power in California, regulating competitive electricity, and FERC's California Market Order. We've enjoyed a long and fruitful, I think, relationship with Dr. Michaels here, and we'll be producing his, I think, 5th paper for us in just a few days on the issue that we're talking about today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michaels.
Thank you, Bill. As always, I'm honored to be here and to thank the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which has so generously and kindly supported me in the past. And I also thank them for having the foresight to have this in a hotel that was very close to 6th Street. The topic that we're going to be dealing with today is ongoing research that I'm doing with Professor Andy Cleet from Penn State University. The papers are about to come out. We're about to post one on Social Science Research Network for anyone who's interested in it that's got the details of what I'm going to be talking about today. The usual disclaimer, nothing I say here is the official views of anyone I've ever spoken with in my entire life. Listen, you don't have my lease, new one. You've got my old presentation. Yeah. I don't know what to do now. Okay. Well, there's going to be a slight disconnect between what's on the graphics and, anyway. Okay. Essentially, what we want to talk about, I've got several blocks of ideas here that I think we're going to have to be able to get through, talk about what I think is going to help clean up some of the differences that I may be having with other analysts of the ERCOT markets, and to try to figure out exactly what the future is likely to be, what it is most likely to look like. ERCOT is one of the most remarkable institutions the electricity industry has ever invented. It's done much more than keep the lights on. A market is not one of those places where supply curves cross demand curves and bore you to tears. A market is a place where people invent transactions. And what ERCOT is good for is that ERCOT has allowed people to invent remarkable ranges of transactions, both in terms of the production of power, the distribution of power, and the retailing of power. No other market has ever come close to being that innovative, and for that, we have to credit a lot of Texas institutions that have worked very well. And they have done more than kept the lights on. Generation has been adequate, it has been economic, and we're opening up in lots of new ways to accommodate renewables, new options in demand management that are coming, and the rest. What is the real reason that's going on? Basically, ERCOT makes people responsible. ERCOT does not guarantee a regulatory system that guarantees revenues to producers, freezes consumers' rates. It says to both sides, you can be competitive, you can make money, and like in any other industry, things happen that you'd expect. Our question then is, we've got several rungs to do. The first question is investment in new generation really inadequate in ERCOT? That's part of the key question that we're going to be going on here, and I will show you a little bit of numbers that are quite critical of those kinds of arguments and give alternative explanations. Then I want to go on and talk about what the choices our producers have, why there have been some misinterpretations of what happens in these markets, and some of the numerical conclusions people read into them are a bit misleading. Finally, for those of you who hoped Sam Newell and I would go out in the parking lot afterwards, we find ourselves in a remarkable amount of agreement on a fundamental question, which is the question of what reserve margin is worth having and why. That is the fundamental question for all of this, and it sort of gets thrown into the background in our haste to analyze current situations. And I think we're all going to need to be thinking about this a lot more. Is there a crisis? Is it real? That brings up your question, what's the right amount of investment to be making? In other markets, we never say that. In other markets, we simply say, okay, people are going to be looking out to make money, and therefore they're going to figure out how much to invest. And there may be booms, there may be lulls, but the question is here, electricity, in part because of its regulated heritage, has some special, supposedly, aspects. And that leaves us to the question, well, if we are willing to agree that it's inadequate, what are the alternatives to resolve it? And electricity is an industry that is inextricably tied up with politics. For all we try to bring a market to it, there are still large and important political influences on it, and those tend to, in some cases, conflict with what happens in markets. And now and then, as happened at least in part with the formation of ERCOT, they happen to further markets along. But the question is, why is electricity so special? What is it about electricity that makes it so different from other industries that we can't trust people to simply invest as they wish, compete with each other, and let the invisible hand take care of everything? That's going to be a question we'll come to in just a second. Commissioner Anderson has given us basically the simple story of what the current supposed crisis is. Early 2012, things looked grim because of the EPA, because of a delayed coal plant. These are idiosyncrasies, and what happens? Things change unexpectedly to a lot of people. Apparently, a lot of new generation has been announced. It's coming online, becoming certificated. And again, if it's becoming more valuable, this is not something that surprises us. Maybe this isn't really as extraordinary a market as we want to make it out to be. The thing is, in Texas, investment in any industry, if you're an economist, is impossible to predict. Econometrically, it's one of the greatest puzzles there is. And electricity, in that sense, is nothing really that special. And here we have a really interesting problem because there's so much about investment in electricity in Texas that we really can't find out. And it's a good thing we can't find it out, because so much of the Texas electrical markets are transactions that are under contracts. What we see is the 5–10% of the market that comes out in the balancing and ancillary services, where we have very visible energy prices and capacity prices. The rest of the market involves contracts whose terms we don't know and whose terms we shouldn't know. And those are what really drives the market. I wish we knew more about them, but it's probably best we don't. What do we have for forecasts instead? The one thing you've got to remember is we invariably underpredict capacity. If you look at the CDR reports, the lines on that graphic, the left-hand axis, vertical axis, is what would be the current year. And then we take the projected reserve margins for 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years ahead on the basis of this capacity demand reserve reports. And guess what? In practically all of those years, we got a crisis coming within 5 years. Why is there always a crisis coming? Well, you're in Texas. Same reason there's always only 10 years worth of oil reserves left. It's not worth finding it. It's not worth making the investment. These are plans that don't have to be made, generally speaking, until everybody gets a better idea of what's coming in the market. The 2 years that looked the worst on the graph, by the way, when the 5 years had passed, we were well within what at the time was the 13.75% margin. Why is there a crisis? Is this a crisis? No. I don't want to see the capital markets financing premature investments. I don't want to see consumers being forced to carry their costs along as they would be in a regulatory system. And finally, I don't want this because you've got to look at the realistic alternative. Is it this kind of practices that take place in ERCOT? Or would you rather have a full-blown regulatory process that certificated new plants and governed the returns to their owners? Well, there may be inadequate investment for another reason, the so-called missing money problem. And the missing money problem, it's a phrase that was actually invented by a friend of mine. The argument is, if it's really a competitive market, then at least some generators will be unable to recover their capital costs because prices will be so low they'll just cover their operating costs. And if that's the case, then maybe investment will be inadequate because people won't invest in capacity until they're really sure that they're going to be able to get their investments back. There's no evidence of this in Texas. The theoretical models for it assume a tremendous number of things which are very doubtful when we start looking at real markets. And in particular, one of the questions we've been wanting to ask is, what if we really look at the official figures in Texas? And a lot in Texas is based on a figure, don't you just love these terms, a peaker net margin. And peaker net margin says, how much would a new peaking unit, combustion turbine or combined cycle plant, make in energy market prices if in fact it paid fuel prices, which were contemporaneous, received energy market prices, and then you'd look at what that margin was, that margin between its revenue from the energy market and its fuel and operating costs. And you'd say, hey, is that margin big enough for us to recover our capital on? And As it turns out, if you look at the peak or net margin, boy, it looks like a crisis. Practically every one of the years they've calculated it for, since the founding of ERCOT, the peak or net margin has been far, far above the actual earnings that would get calculated. I'm sorry, has been far below the actual amount required to recover capital, the pink lines. And so the question is, this is really strange now. The anomalous years, the ones with the high blue lines, those are all exceptions for one another reason. We don't need to go into them, but they are anomalies. In other words, it looks like nobody should ever be making any money, and they'd be fools to be investing in power plants in Texas. But ever since the inception of ERCOT, they've kept doing it. Well, that came across as a paradox to us. At least in part, this results from the fact that what we've got is a contract regime that we can't see a lot of. But the other part of it is that we haven't looked at the ancillary services markets. So we've gotten hourly pricing data, hourly operating data, and what we've been doing is we've been starting to model the decisions of generators as to whether they should produce energy for the balancing market or produce one of the various ancillary services, the various types of reserves, load following, similar things that are necessary to maintain reliability. And essentially, we won't give you the numbers or any of the really, really dreary details of the calculation. Those are in the paper. But what we find is that when we assume there's a rational decision and reasonable expectations about prices and a rational decision by generators, in fact, when you take a look at all their sources of income, even in just these markets, they're around break even or better, and it shouldn't surprise you that, in fact, you're getting investment. The figures, the missing money figures, the money's not really missing. And again, those kinds of facts, it's amazing how much we've thought about this without looking at some fairly simple numbers. So we've added that, dreary slide, and then you get to the big question. What should the reserve margin be? And that's a complicated question. The so-called 1 in 10 standard doesn't help us very much. The real question about the nature of blackouts, so few of them are at the system-wide level, in fact, none to speak of that are worth noticing, and almost all of them are low-voltage affairs. What's to be done? And that's going to be the question of choosing the reserve amount. The actual investment behavior, instead of a disaster, people keep wanting to build stuff. And the big thing that's coming on the horizon, and this is going on, and there's all sorts of corporate things which are keeping us from understanding a lot of how it's growing. How fast is demand response going to grow? How big is it going to be? So we go back to the first question. The first question before we want to reform markets in any way is to figure out exactly what looks like an appropriate reserve margin. And that's a really, really hard thing. ERCOT, as we say, determines its reserve margin by the market, on the basis of people's actual investment. I don't want to go into the topic. I thought we'd be talking more about so-called proposals for a capacity market here. We can talk more about them at the end, and we can talk about what the long-run possibilities would be if, in fact, we had that. The real issue that matters here is that ERCOT functions well. There's very little evidence that investment performs inadequately or poorly in ERCOT, or that we need far-fetched definitions to explain why the institution has survived. I leave you with one thought. The first law of economics. You've all heard the first law of economics. Something about free lunches. If you ever want to bore your students, try using it in class. The first law of economics is really this. Things are only good or bad when you compare them with the realistic alternatives. And the realistic alternatives to ERCOT and its system are the kinds that exist in the rest of the country. And on that basis, you should think really, really hard before you abandon an ERCOT system of markets, which, while imperfect, has gotten you a whole lot and probably will do so in the future as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Michaels. Our final speaker this morning is Representative Patricia Harless. Representative Harless was first elected to Texas House of Representatives back in 2006. She's currently serving her 4th term representing District 126, which encompasses Northwest Harris County. As the owner of Fred Fincher Motors in Houston and a lifelong resident of the area, Representative Harless has deep roots in her community and is an active small business owner and civic leader. In the Texas House of Representatives, she serves on the Committee on State Affairs, the Licensing and Administrative Procedures Committee, and the Redistricting Committee. And on State Affairs, she's been up to her neck in this issue for several sessions. Please join me in welcoming Representative Patricia Harless.
Well, it's always scary when they ask a blonde female to be on a panel with all these men that know so much about electricity. And I can guarantee you they are much smarter in this issue than I am. I'm a free market girl. I believe that the market works and that if you have a competitive environment, that an entrepreneur that's innovative will not only thrive, but not only survive, but also thrive. Having said that, my day job is an automobile dealer. And up to this point, we've been pretty successful in business. Every year when I sit down to forecast the next 5 years, there are certain things that I depend on. Being able to operate my computer system and turn on my lights and have energy to contract to my customers. And so I think that we have a responsibility to provide that security to our businesses for Texas to continue to be successful. As a legislator, it's difficult to walk that balancing line that we have to walk. How do we keep Texas competitive and guarantee that there are resources for the future without overstepping our bounds? And over the last few years, I've heard a lot of different discussions about the sky is falling. And as the professor said, 2011 was an anomaly. Well, the anomaly was that we had a drought, an extreme heat wave. And because of that anomaly, we are already got 2 bills and several others filed that are going to help us address our water infrastructure. So we are planning to spend millions and possibly billions of dollars to help establish water infrastructure for the future based on that anomaly. Shouldn't we do the same for our energy markets? Don't we need to be forward thinking? It's easy to say that there's not a problem, but those of you that are generators know how expensive and how difficult it is to bring a plant online or to build a new plant. It's not something that you can say, okay, we need more generation by next week or next month. I do see our role as the legislature to more as an oversight. We are very, very fortunate in Texas to have agencies that have been very responsive to the people they serve. The leadership on PUC, ERCOT, the Railroad Commission, they've worked very hard at making sure that they forecast out, they look at all the options, and they adjust their rules as they see the need. I think that you will see this session aggressive legislators that think that we're not forward-thinking enough. So there's no doubt that we'll have legislation filed. I don't see that that moves very far as long as PUC and ERCOT continue to be responsive to the people they serve. Texas is so unique, and we want to compare it to other states that have a capacity-only market. But Texas is one state, one grid, and one regulator. I don't think there's any other markets that are contained exactly like that. One of the things that when I hear the debate about building new transmission facilities, they say interest is low, the money is available. Just because the interests are low doesn't mean that a business can get a loan. A lot of the businesses nowadays would love to be able to get a loan to increase their business or to grow their business, but it's not always possible. Another thing that we hear a lot is about the mothballed plants. Well, I think we have a responsibility to provide for generation and transmission of energy, but we also have a responsibility to take into consideration the environment. If you bring up to speed some of these plants that were built in the 70s, it's going to cost you twice as much and probably produce half or a fourth of what a new facility could produce. So those are all the things that we have to consider before we step in and try to influence and move a regulatory agency in a certain direction. Lastly, I'll end so that y'all can ask some questions because they've got some great things I'm sure they want to discuss about more, is we need to be sensitive to the transmission of the energy we generate. We learned that with wind. When you start generating it, you've got to have a way to move that energy. There are cities, Houston is one, that transmission isn't always able to be expanded. I'm not sure that San Antonio's not following close behind. So we have to be cognizant of all the pieces of the pie and not take a gut reaction and then spend the next 2 or 3 or 4 sessions dealing with unintended consequences of the decisions we make. So thank you for having me here today, and I think we're happy to answer questions.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I have a couple I'd like to ask the panel, but since we're running short on time, I'll see if there's any in the audience before we get started with that. Well, did y'all have any comments based on the other panelists that y'all wanted to make? Some in particular y'all went up front? Sam, Commissioner Anderson? Anything?
I'll mention something
Okay.
that I wanted to elaborate on Commissioner Anderson as far as your power to choose and choosing your rates. Another thing that we've done in the areas of Houston and across state and Dallas is the smart meters. And I know there's some controversy sometimes discussed around those, but I think that was such a forward-thinking proposal, and they have been so beneficial to me as a consumer. I have had my smart meter for a year, and my husband calls me the smart meter Nazi because now I won't let him do any energy-related usage during the day. We have to run our pool at night, we dry our clothes at night, we run the dishwasher at night. But I was able to cut my electricity bill by $100 every single month this summer. And given the consumer the ability to control their usage and to adjust their usage during peak demand has been great in our house.
Sure.
I agree, and there's one of the things that I think you're going to see, and one large retailer's already announced this product, is they're offering customers who have advanced meters and who are on a postpaid contract. I don't want to get into that detail. Up to 30 cents a kilowatt when they reduce their consumption when called upon. Now, you say 30 cents. Well, that translates to the equivalent of $300 megawatt hour in the wholesale market. That compares to, say, an average customer's rate of 8 or 9 cents. So we're talking about real money. And again, what this particular retailer is trying to do is engage their customer to be a partner in the market, because that retailer will use their customer either to hedge their downside risk if they haven't bought enough power on a hot August day, or if they have bought enough power on a hot August day in advance, but prices are going well above $300 a megawatt hour, they can sell that power back, and they're basically splitting, a portion of the proceeds with their customer. So as we see that evolve in the marketplace, that's exciting. And then with respect to advanced meters, and I tell this to those who are concerned about them. I think the investments is beneficial, and really I would have done it just on the basis of reliability, and storm restoration. Under the old system, the utility didn't know your lights were out unless you called them. Now they know it and often can fix the problem before you even know about it. The only way you know that there was ever a problem is you come home and your clocks are blinking or your coffee maker. And that, as the folks in Houston found out in the hurricanes, just having the utility know exactly who's on and who's off, it will be a huge improvement in reliability.
But the other thing about it is there's really a double payoff from it, thanks to the nature of ERCOT and the fact that before you even talk about your abilities to conserve and time shift your use, you can choose contracts. You got a contract that you can already start from that is most advantageous to you. And then after that, you still have further adjustments you can make on your own. Other states, people can't choose these types of contracts, much less choose their types of suppliers. You're getting paid double.
Sammy, anything else you want to offer?
Hey, Joe.
Oh, okay. We'll take one
I'm
more
a gas
question.
producer out in West Texas, and I'm familiar with the program that you referred to. We actually have quite a bit of production that's behind a co-op, and therefore it's not eligible to go into that program. Are we ever going to get to a position in the state of Texas where we come out from underneath those co-op rules?
That is a decision for Representative Harless, and you all do. That's, you know, the.
I didn't do that to you.
No, that truly is a legislative decision. There was, when we went to competition, it was in the investor-owned utility space, as well as both municipalities who had utilities and co-ops had the option to go to competition. The only one that immediately chose it, I think, was Corpus Christi back when we first did it. There are now some areas, there have been some co-ops that have converted to private and then have gone to competition. Recently, for example, those of you who used to be who are in ERCOT and in the old West Texas utility area, which used to be a co-op, well, Sherryland bought that, and that area is moving to competition. And so you'll be able to. But at the end of the day, and really it's not even a legislative decision at this point, it's really a decision to take you off the hook. It's a decision of the co-op and the municipality. And there, the big hurdle is well, with the munis, one of the issues is, frankly, that a lot of municipalities, not all, but a lot of municipalities use the profit off the utility to help subsidize their city operations. I'm not saying that's bad, I'm saying that's a fact. That probably, well, I won't even speculate on what it does, but that's the fact. In the co-op area, that's really, at the end of the day, up to the members and their boards of what they want to do. And if what I think will happen is that you'll continue to see on a relative longer-term basis that prices in competitive areas are lower than what amounts to a regulated rate in a co-op. At some point, the members are going to say, wait a minute, how come I'm paying 14 cents and my friend who owns the feed store in a competitive space is paying 6 cents?
I'll have to add to that, be very careful what you ask for, because just 4 to 6 years ago, when I first started out in the legislature, my biggest complaint from constituents in Houston was, why can't we be like Austin and be in a muni or a co-op, because their rates are so much lower. When we had Ike and the natural gas prices spiked and electricity rates were up, they all wanted to live in your area where it was regulated. So be careful what you ask for. It's just, one of these days, ours is going to be way high and yours is going to be low, and you're going to wish you were back where you're at, so.
All right, well, thank you very much. We've enjoyed having the panel up here today, and join me in thanking them one more time.